Good morning. My name is Dr. Farooq. I am Registrar of Nephrology in Pakistan Kidney University, Lahore. And we will start our next session. For this session, I would like to invite Dr. Fazal. So please, if you can chair the session. And for the co-chair, I would like to invite Professor of Nephrology, Dr. Salman Tahir. He is from Chief Medical City, Lahore.
It's an honor for me to invite Fredric Finkelstein. He is the head of the nephrology division in the Yale University and is the president of the International Society of Peritoneal Dialysis.
And thanks to all for coming. It was a wonderful evening last night. We got back about a little after 1 in the morning, so thank you all very much for getting up this early to come to the lecture. It's really been a pleasure and an honor for me to participate in this really excellent conference. My wife and I spent the last week in Pakistan, in Islamabad, and Zafrabad, and here, and it's indeed been a pleasure for us to enjoy this wonderful country, the hospitality of the people, and the beauty of the scenery. So I'm going to talk this morning about a global perspective of peritoneal dialysis, 19. And again, this reflects data that's in 2016. So I'm going to show you a slide in a minute that shows how PD and HD vary around the globe, but it has to be put in the right context. So one thing that we discussed in the meeting in charge of is how do you explain this tremendous variation in end-stage kidney disease around the world? The highest rates are in Taiwan and Japan, next highest are in the United States, as shown here, but the US rates are 2 to 3-fold higher than you see in Europe, 2-fold higher than you see in Canada, and as the economics of the countries get worse, the incident rates, that is the treated rates of patients with end-stage kidney disease, get lower and lower. I don't believe Pakistan is not on this slide. I don't believe Pakistan has a registry for end-stage kidney disease, but Bangladesh, for example, is running at 51 per year. So when we look at the way home therapies are segregated, we need to look at this. Now I'm going to talk more about the varying rates of end-stage kidney disease in my talk later on this morning when I discuss the end-stage kidney disease summit that is held in the UAE. So this shows the percent distribution of prevalent dialysis patients by modality. Where the bluish is hemodialysis, the orange is peritoneal dialysis, and the yellowish color is home hemodialysis, which accounts for a very small percentage of patients on home therapies. But again, you see this tremendous variation. You have countries like Japan, which is really up at the very top, that has about 3% of its patients on home dialysis. The US has about 10 or 11% on PD therapy now. Countries in the UK, Australia, Netherlands, Canada, for example, are running at between 20 and 25%. And then you get up to numbers where 80% are on PD therapy in countries like Hong Kong. And I wanted to sort of review for you what the differences are in these countries. So let's start with Hong Kong and Thailand. Hong Kong started a PD First program many years ago. And that was that the government would only pay for treatments for end-stage kidney disease if patients went on PD, unless there was an absolute contraindication for PD therapy. In this model, 80% of patients with end-stage kidney disease are maintained on peritoneal dialysis. And patients in Hong Kong understand that the costs need to be contained to protect the low tax structure of universal health coverage that's present in Hong Kong. So PD in Hong Kong is much cheaper than it is for hemodialysis, so I'll come back to this in just a minute. Thailand started a PD First policy about 5 or 6 years ago, and what's interesting about that, if you look at the slides on the right-hand side, the top is patient survival, the bottom is technique survival. The dotted line is what's happened since they started the PD First policy. The bottom line is what happened prior to starting the PD First policy. So people thought when they introduced the PD First policy, technique survival rates, patient survival rates would decline because they'd be putting patients on PD who were not optimal candidates. But the reverse was true. Actually, the results got better. As did peritonitis rates. The example suggested really that as you get more experience with PD therapy, outcomes really improve because you understand how to deal with the complications that arise. And that's something that's held up everywhere in the world when this is looked at. That the more patients you have on the therapy, the better the outcomes become. So Thailand is a very interesting lesson for lower resource countries to look at when deciding how end-stage kidney disease therapy ought to be developed. So Mexico is an example where, and this is the state of Mexico, Jalisco is the primary state in Mexico that has the best data, suggesting that available resources drive practice patterns, that PD utilization in this state had been at 90% because of almost no hemodialysis. So the government was paying for end-stage kidney disease care, but they put 90% of patients on PD. Now, Jalisco is south of Mexico City. It's a very poor province, a very poor state. So the patients are very poor. This is not a well-developed country, a high-income country. It's a low-income country. And the results really for Mexico have always been very good. But when the government allowed private companies to come in and build dialysis, hemodialysis units, hemo units expanded and PD utilization dropped, and it's now running about 50%. But importantly, the cost of PD is very low in Mexico. There's an excellent company that makes PD solution, and the government does the contracting. So this for the PD supplies. And this gives an example of what I call the power of the single purchaser. That if the government decides that they purchase supplies for the entire state, for the entire country, for example, they can negotiate significant discounts in pricing and keep the postage very low. So this is a very good example also for low-resource countries of a way of thinking of coordinating care, coordinating purchasing as a way of reducing costs. In the United States, as with most things, finances drive practice patterns, unfortunately. That's what happens in a capitalist society, I guess. But the government and private insurance pays for all care, but 90% of dialysis is provided by for-profit companies who build dialysis units and work the hemodialysis units and work to keep the chairs filled with patients and maximize revenue. So that has always kept the cost of percentage of patients on PD extremely low, but traditionally was running about 7% in the United States. But in 2010, the government introduced a bundled payment system, which was they paid a flat fee for dialysis, which included all medications, ESAs, for example, intravenous iron, vitamin D supplementation, etc. In that model, though, the cost of PD becomes much less, and PD becomes more and more profitable. So this shows what's happening to the incident and prevalent patients on home dialysis, which is primarily PD. And in 2010, when the bundled payment system goes into effect, lo and behold, the numbers start to rise. And the numbers on PD therapy are rising in the US to up to about 11 or 12% now, and most people think it's going to level off somewhere around 15% or so. But again, this is an example of finances driving practice patterns. If you made the finances in favor of PD therapy will grow. But in Europe, Canada, and Australia, it's a more reputable system in many ways, and patient education really drives practice patterns. So as I showed you, there's reduced access to end-stage kidney disease care because the incident numbers I showed you, remember, were much higher in the US than they were in Canada, Australia, or most European countries. But the government provides equitable support to health care. Care is much better organized. All these countries have CKD clinics, low-clearing clinics with people with GFRs less than 20. They have palliative care, they have a patient-centered care approach, and an emphasis on patient education. And this model, 18 to 25% of patients wind up in home therapy, which primarily are peritoneal dialysis. So this is an example of what happens. This is data from, it's old data, but the same data holds up today from the Netherlands, published in 2004, where patients were given choices about therapy. And in this model, 38% of incident patients with end-stage kidney disease starting dialysis started on peritoneal dialysis. And this model is held up in other countries as well. So if patients are given a free choice, provided proper education, 38% would start on peritoneal dialysis. But Canada is an interesting example, and primarily I'm going to focus on the province of Ontario. And this is where Dimitri Oriopoulos first started CABD in 1978. That's where the treatment actually originated. Peter Blake is now in charge of nephrology throughout the province of Ontario. They have a nephrologist who coordinates all of the nephrology care throughout the province. They've had a tremendous effort to grow home therapies, and Oriopoulos, as well as Peter Blake, have set targets of having 30% of patients on home therapies. But despite this tremendous effort, they're now running these numbers here: 75% on hemodialysis, 5% on home hemodialysis, and 20% on peritoneal dialysis. And these numbers are really leveled off now. They're not increasing anymore. In fact, they started to drop slightly. So to my mind, this number is probably a very appropriate number and reasonable expectation, that if you really make an effort to grow PD and allow patients to make decisions without forcing them onto PD because of financial incentives, you can probably get 25% of the patients in home therapy, and the vast majority of these on dialysis. So what about the costs? I mean, should PD, I mentioned that PD is cheaper, and how much cheaper is it? So again, what's important about this is you have to think of this in a holistic view. It's not simply the cost of dialysis, it's a complete cost of caring for patients. And this is from the USRDS database. And it shows that if you look at the cost of caring for patients, take into account medication, hospitalizations, transportation to dialysis facilities, etc. Dialysis only accounts for about 40% of the total cost of caring for those patients. And in this model, PD is significantly less costly than hemodialysis. In the US, it's $16,000 per year cheaper than hemodialysis. This is taking into account everything. If you look at the dialysis procedure itself simply, cost accounting for hemodialysis becomes very challenging because you need to take into account the cost of building a facility, the cost of machines, electricity, water, etc. And yet when you look at PD, you have to look at obviously what the cost of the PD supplies is. We understand that in Pakistan, the cost of PD supplies is actually very low, lower than this in the United States, which surprised me, or in Europe. And in that model, the cost of providing PD therapy should actually be very low. And the cost for PD, maintaining a patient on PD therapy with somewhere between 3 and 4 exchanges a day should be really no more than $4,000 by my calculations. Maybe that's something we can discuss later. So the important issue is, when the patient-centered care world, patients should be making decisions about what type of treatment they want. And what do we tell patients? What should we tell them about what are the outcomes comparing PD to HD? Are they really different? And is there advantage to one or the other? And what's the impact of the treatments on health-related quality of life? So, in the 90s, there was early studies to suggest that certain types of PD patients, elderly patients, patients with diabetes, did worse on PD than HD. That hasn't held up. And most people think now the outcomes are identical for PD and HD patients, whether or not you have diabetes. On the left is data from Ontario, and the right is data from the USRDS. But the things seem held up anywhere in the world now when you look at these outcome data. There is no difference in mortality rates between the two groups. It probably is a low hospitalization rate for patients on peritoneal dialysis. But importantly, the mortality rate for patients on peritoneal dialysis has really declined. And this is an important slide, again from the USRDS of 2018, showing the mortality rate of hemodialysis patients shown in blue, and the mortality rate of PD patients shown in orange. And there is a significant drop in mortality rates from 2000 and up to 2016 in these outcomes. It seems to have leveled off now, but really mortality rates have really dropped. And the mortality rates in PD have gone down, and I was discussing some breakfast this morning. And it's really because of the impact of this international guidelines. So the ISPD has been terrific in making guidelines for the care of patients that apply across the globe. And this has resulted in significant drops in peritonitis rates, for example, and improvement in outcomes everywhere in the world. So peritonitis rates have dropped. When I started doing PD, which was in 1979, we were running infection rates 1 in every 12 months, for example. We're now running about 1 in 40 patient months. And if you look at data from PDOCS, and so that's the DOC study now focusing on PD patients, infection rates in Japan are extremely low, 1 in 80 and 90 patient months. And the averaging around the world in 1 in 36 and 40 patient months. And countries like Thailand, which have a PD first policy, have a very low infection rate. I think perhaps Dr. Brown's going to discuss that later on this morning when she talks about peritonitis. There's been a decrease in exit site infections, better management of infections, improvements in catheter placements, better understanding of the psychosocial support necessary, better understanding of the dose of dialysis, which I discussed at the PD workshop on Friday, and better management of ultrafiltration. So the care of patients in PD has gotten a lot better. There are very detailed guidelines on the ISPD website that you can download for free that talk about how all PD patients really should be managed, and that has had a significant improvement that to me has been the driver in the improvement in outcomes of PD around the globe. So what about health-related quality of life? So the studies basically show, and this is from several studies, and health-related quality of life, usually standard instruments, SF36, KDQOL, EuroQ, 5Q, Euro 5 study, measure of health-related quality of life. There's no real difference in outcomes. This is showing you data here from the CHOICE study, which is a study based in Hopkins looking at new patients starting dialysis at the start and 1 year later, and studies from our program in the Haven looking at the MCS and PCS scores, which are the mental composite scores and physical composite scores in the SF36. And you can see those are the two graphs on the upper panel. There's no difference in outcomes. But if you look at patient satisfaction, that is how satisfied are patients with their treatment, and which treatment has a negative impact on the patient's quality of life, the scores for PD are better than they are in HD, and that's shown in the lower panel. And that's held up in other studies. And Dr. Brown is putting together this fabulous study now, looking at DOCS database from peritoneal dialysis and hemodialysis patients around the globe from 5 different countries. And the data is just to summarize the data, I don't want to go through this in detail. This is looking at PCS scores on the left, MCS scores on the right from the SF36. And they're ranked by different score levels, which you can see here. And there really is no difference when you look at this. But if you look at the burden of kidney disease, again taken from the KDQOL or SF36, there is a significant difference here between the PD patients and the hemodialysis patients, confirming what I just showed you from our own studies, that PD has less of a negative impact on patient outcomes, on patients, the negative impact of therapy on patients. Okay. I'm going to shift now and talk a little bit about acute kidney injury, urgent start PD, and a couple comments on the future of PD and the opportunities for PD expansion. So again, we discussed this at breakfast about the PD utilization for AKI. So 20 years ago, PD was the standard treatment for acute kidney injury. And this changed with the introduction of central venous catheters for hemodialysis and the proliferation of extra-corporeal therapies and devices. And pretty much PD was abandoned in most European and North American dialysis facilities to manage patients with acute kidney injury. And everybody was put on hemodialysis. But this whole model shifted based on a couple of studies that came out of Brazil. This is sort of the key study now. This is a randomized trial comparing mortality rates with high volume PD and daily hemodialysis. And this was done in really intensive care units in Brazil, so they're actually sick patients with higher Apache scores, which is shown on the right there. But again, it's a randomized trial with 75 patients in each group. And the patient outcomes are shown in the upper left. You can see there's no difference in outcomes. But the table on the bottom is really the important one, which is that recovery of renal function was more rapid in the patients receiving PD compared to HD, and there was more rapid resolution of acute kidney injury. So remember that patients on PD with end-stage kidney disease had better preservation of residual renal function than patients on hemodialysis, presumably related to less incidence of hypotension, less problems with plastic exposure to blood, for example, and cytokine stimulation. But this study was very interesting. It raised the question whether there really are adverse effects from hemodialysis in managing patients with acute kidney injury. And in fact, if you look at the data that Chris McIntyre, who was in the UK and now in Ontario, has published, looking at the negative effects of hemodialysis-associated hypertension and myocardial function, cognitive function, endotoxemia, for example, because of bowel ischemia, one begins to wonder whether acute hemodialysis for patients with AKI may have not just short-term but long-term adverse consequences, and that there may be real advantages to using PD. So this was then confirmed in a randomized trial from Saudi Arabia, published by Abdullah Al-Huesh last year, and he compared PD now with CVD-HD in critically ill patients in non-Saudi Arabia. And importantly, he showed a better survival and shorter duration of dialysis in patients treated with PD. And again, this was about 75 patients in each group. So again, raising the question, is PD really being underutilized for managing patients with acute kidney injury? And based on these studies, now we've started to reintroduce PD as a treatment for acute kidney injury. So that brings me to the Saving Lives Project now. So the Saving Lives Project is a program that was started with the ISN, and it was started in response to a grant that the ISN got from Baxter to develop a program to manage patients with acute kidney injury in Africa. And when we looked at this, we decided the best way to do this was with peritoneal dialysis because it's such a simple treatment, it avoids the problems of electricity, machinery, etc. So the goal then is to provide educational support for the treatment of AKI in low-resource settings. And we've developed 16 sites, which are shown here, really through Africa and one in Southeast Asia. And what's important about this, the model we used to do this was we would find there are very few nephrologists in any of these countries. So we find a general intern or a resident who is interested in our project. We train them in another site. They would go to a high-resource country, South Africa, Brazil, European country, to learn how to put in PD catheters and the basic principles of PD. You can teach that in between 4 and 6 weeks. They would go back to their country of origin and start the PD program to treat patients with AKI. So this is, again, not nephrologists putting in cuffed catheters, treating patients with AKI with PD. Thus far, we've managed over 600 patients with AKI. Mortality rate has been about 25% in hospital. We focused on children primarily, so the mean age was low. The mean creatinine score was high. These patients really did need dialysis. The mean duration of dialysis was 13 days. What we suggested was not using trocars, but using cuff catheters, because the cuff catheters can stay in as long as you need to manage the patient with acute kidney injury and not subject them to the risk of putting in trocar-based catheters repeatedly. And most of them use commercially prepared solutions, but those who couldn't do that, we advised them on how to manufacture their own solutions locally. And the outcomes were really terrific with this. So based on that experience, the ISPD developed guidelines for using PD for acute kidney injury. And we got together a group of people around the world to develop these guidelines. And the conclusions for this are the following. That PD should be considered as a suitable method of renal replacement therapy for patients with AKI. We recommended using flexible tunnel PD catheters. And again, there's no ideal method of catheter insertion, but the technique that was shown on Friday's conference, on Friday's workshops, using the Sullivan technique with a peel-away catheter is the one that's easiest to use and the one that we use to train these residents or interns to put in the catheters. And the dose of the PD, I didn't discuss this at length, but it's discussed very carefully in these guidelines that are on the ISPD website. You target a KTV of about 2.1, higher if it's necessary. There's a whole description of why we decided that was the appropriate dose. We recommended the commercial solutions be used, but if you couldn't use that, it's easy to make your own solutions. And we gave formulas on how to do that in these guidelines, using either normal saline, half normal saline, lactated release, bottle solution, whatever. It's very easy to do this. And they've done this now in several sites in Africa, very successful. The lessons that we learned from that are that first, that PD can be easily done to treat patients with AKI. Training physicians and nurses to do PD was not at all difficult. We did this very easily from extremely low resource countries. Cuff catheters can be easily placed at bedside by internists and nurses using the Sullivan technique, and the complication rate is extremely low. Infection rates were surprisingly low with this procedure. So it's a very easy thing to do. And part of the outcome of the saving lives study was, there's been a whole interest now in urgent start PD. I think part of it comes from our experience in Africa, training these physicians in low resource countries to put in the catheters. And the fact that you can put in the catheter and use it right away. So using the Sullivan technique, where you use a small needle, a guide wire, a dilator, and the catheter placement, you can use the PD catheter right away, and the leak rates and the complication rates are extremely low. So urgent start PD is that the initiation of PD within 2 weeks of catheter insertion, or even right after the catheter is placed. And the reason this has gotten so much attention around the world is the recognition of the increased mortality risk with urgent start HD patients. So someone comes into the emergency department, is admitted to the hospital with advanced renal failure and needs to start dialysis urgently, which commonly happens in the United States, for example. You're much better off starting on PD than HD. And you're putting the catheter with the Sullivan technique and using PD and not HD. So this works very well. And the key study on this is this one from Jeff Crow in Canada, again, looking at survival rates by modality and access type. And you can see here that patients who start dialysis with a central venous catheter have a significantly higher mortality rate than those who start with PD were an AV fistula, an AV graft, and this is data from the Canadian registry. So this data has really driven the PD, and the experience we got in Africa with the Saving Lives program has really been important in saying that yes, you can put a catheter in, you can train almost anyone to do it, the complication rate is low, and it works very well. So based on this, there's papers now from all over the world, so it's shown here on urgent start PD, it works, it's a very successful thing to do. Outcomes are really very good. Okay, I just want to say a few words of new developments in PD and conclude with a final recommendation for what should happen in setting up PD programs in lower resource countries. So, a redefinition of high quality PD. This is something that's important and it's discussed by Dr. Brown, that the definition of high quality PD has really shifted away from focusing on dose of dialysis to looking at a holistic approach, focusing on patient outcomes and health-related quality of life and what's best for an individual patient. This is a paper that will be published in PDI very shortly, and it's a very important paper because it changes the whole way that we actually think about peritoneal dialysis. We talked about low GDP solutions at the session of workshops on Friday, and these are solutions that are more expensive than commercial solutions and standard PD solutions. The trick here is to sterilize a solution but not generate low glucose degradation products which stimulate inflammation in the peritoneal membrane. They're more expensive, they're not approved by the FDA in the US. We don't use them, the value of them is uncertain. And it's not something I think that is at all appropriate for Pakistan. Online generation of PD solutions is a new generation of PD cyclists that have come out, which technically will be complicated in the sense that you can make online generation of PD solutions, but it's going to reduce the cost of PD therapy probably and simplify the procedure. And this is an interesting outcome that people are waiting for the machines to get approved to be used. There's some interesting data in wearable PD now where you regenerate the PD solution with the use of sorbents. There's some pilot projects that are going on now in Singapore, and this is an interesting thing to follow. How practical this will be, I'm not sure about. And lastly is the expansion of PD in both high and low resource countries, based in part upon the recommendations of the ISN. So let me just show you a couple of things on that. This is a model of how the wearable PD system would actually work. So it's a compact system which will be 2 liters of dialysis solution, which regenerates by running over the adsorbent cartridges shown here. How practical it is to walk around this for X number of hours, I'm not sure whether people can use this at night while they sleep. I'm not sure about how technically this will work. Managing ultrafiltration presents problems with this model. But this may in fact be part of the future of PD. It's interesting to watch and see how this develops. I want to mention the ISN Affordable Dialysis Prize. This was a prize the ISN gave out in Mexico City. They gave an award for, they put out a request for proposals for a low-cost dialysis procedure or machine. And the award went to an Australian who came up with this model of using solar panels to heat water from a local source to make steam, which is then used to, which then condenses as purified water, mixes with concentrate, and generates PD solution. When I heard about this, I wasn't sure that you could commercially use this solution, but apparently this is being developed in Australia by the George Institute, and there's some models that are going to be tried out in the near future. I haven't quite seen how they work, but this could be a very interesting way of reducing the cost of generating a PD solution. Again, how practical it is, I'm not really sure. It's something to watch. But I want to conclude with this last slide. What are the things that are necessary to establish PD programs in resource-limited settings? And this is, I want to go through these and just mention them all briefly. So first is educate doctors and nurses in the basic principles of PD. This is easy to do. This is not complicated. PD is simple. It's not rocket science. All the guidelines are laid out on the ISPD website. I've done this in Africa very successfully in 7 PD programs. Very simple to do. Secondly, you need to adapt the ISPD guidelines to available resources. So again, you have to look what antibiotics are available, how practical is it to generate solutions, how much solutions can you get, etc. But everything is laid out on the ISPD website. It's easy to do. You have to develop infection control and training protocols, and this needs to be developed locally to conform to what the available personnel are and resources you have. Again, it is not difficult to do this. You need to train nephrologists and surgeons techniques of catheter replacement. Again, this is easy to do. We've done this in Africa very successfully. Importantly, you need to establish a database and registry to track outcomes. That's one of the key recommendations in the ISN Summit meeting. You can't just let programs develop if they've got very high infection rates, high mortality rates. You need to understand why that is. It's essential to get good quality control in there. And the only way to do that is to have a registry and track the outcomes carefully. You need to negotiate a reliable supply of PD solutions. Patients don't get solutions, they're going to die. So you have to make sure that you've got solutions coming in on a regular basis in the country, either manufactured locally or coming in from an outside source. That's absolutely essential. You have to have adequate hemodialysis backup and support. Remember that 10 to 13% of PD patients transfer to hemodialysis every year. You have to be able to have a hemodialysis backup for these patients. They transfer because they have infections, the catheter doesn't work, whatever. But you have to have that backup system. You have to have a referral system for transplantation, obviously, and that's part of any kidney disease care. And lastly, you have to have patient advocacy, education, and support. Patients need to know that this treatment is available and can be done at a reasonable cost and integrated into the government healthcare finance system. So patients have to know about this. You have to educate them. And again, if patients do make choices, the lesson from Australia, from the UK, from Canada, is that 30 to 35% of patients will choose PD if given that choice. So let me stop here. Thank you very much.